by means of a very particular institutional arrangement. The producer, for example, the bread maker who makes bread, how does the bread maker get the bread he or she makes into the hands of the consumers who will eat that bread to nourish their bodies? In a market economy, the mode of passage, the mechanism whereby the product goes from the producer to the consumer, is by means of something we call a market. It's an institution in which the following dance is performed. The baker, I will give you 2 loaves of this rye bread, but only if you give me 3 of your shirts, or 2 of your tomatoes, or 6 of your software program, whatever. That is, the mechanism of distribution involves a quid pro quo exchange, a kind of endless haggling in which the producer seeks to get from the buyer, the consumer, as much of something else as possible before parting with what he's produced. The consumer has to give something in exchange for what the producer gives up. Or to use the language of economics, the product goes from the producer to the consumer by means of market exchange. When a product of labor goes from producer to consumer by means of market exchange, it's called a commodity. If the good is produced but gets from producer to consumer in some other way, it is not a commodity. Let me give you an example. I take my daughter on a walk in the woods. I break a twig from a little tree, and with my knife I carve a little figurine, which, because I enjoy doing it and my little daughter loves it, I hand to her so she can play with it. I am the producer of the figurine. She is the consumer of the figurine. But there has been no market exchange. Consequently, the figurine is a product of labor, but it is not a commodity. Another example. You are having dinner at your family. Your mother makes a lovely dinner because you're visiting. She produces a product, mashed potatoes, and she hands it to you, and you consume these potatoes. A good has been produced, it has been passed from producer to consumer, but it is not a commodity. In human history, as far back as we know, there are infinite examples of human beings using labor to produce things that go from producer to consumer without market exchange. In fact, the vast majority of human history has involved an enormous array of production, an enormous array of consumption, and no markets at all. Very important for you to understand that the market is not some fundamental human invention that has always been there. It mostly hasn't. Indeed, in our own society right now, a vast amount of goods and services are produced right now in the United States. They go from producer, person number 1, to consumer, person number 2, without market exchange. For examples, in your family, countless things are done. By you for your cousin Fred, by your mother for your father for the grandmother, by the grandmother for the grandchildren. Lots of goods and services are produced and passed to a consumer without market exchange. In fact, a story I love to tell to my students, if at the next Thanksgiving dinner, after the good turkey and all that was consumed, and your father said to you across the table, "Oh, would you mind, we've accumulated a lot of garbage from the dinner, the bones, would you take them outside and put them in the garbage? And you, as the young man, said, sure, Pop, $4. In that act of demanding $4, you're making the effort to introduce into the family's distribution system the market as a mechanism. And to that, your father will lean across the table and smack you in the face and give you the following lecture, a very revelatory lecture. That's disgusting, he will say to you. In this family, he will continue, we love each other and we give each other as a result of the love we feel. What you just did was to negate the love by demanding payment. What your father is saying, for which he could be arrested, is that love and markets are incompatible institutions inside the family. We Marxists say, outside too. Think about it. In any case, Marx is clever, and he has noticed, as many before him did, and he gives them credit, that one of the remarkable things about capitalism is that it has gone further than any other system in commodifying human labor. That is, making the goods and services that are produced into commodities. And what does that mean? By making sure that the mechanism that gets goods and services from producers to consumers is quid pro quo exchange in a market. Capitalism has expanded markets. But remember, for Marx, that doesn't negate the fact that in modern society, as through history, much more in the way of passage of goods from producer to consumer happens in non-market forms than in market forms. It's a particular and peculiar way. Let me quickly, because I don't have time, give you examples of other systems. In many societies, the producers get together at a certain time, collect all that they produce, and then how is it distributed? By a priest, by a council of elders, by a drawing of straws, by a notion of what's an appropriate customary distribution. All of those have been used for thousands of years in an endless variety of societies to accomplish the distribution from producer to consumer. Markets are not necessary, markets are not prevalent, markets are no more or less efficient than anything else. And they haven't pleased human beings any more than non-market mechanisms have, if we look at the long sweep of history. So Marx is going to begin with commodities, but he's going to debunk the whole business all at the same time. That we do not, as he will say a little later in volume 1, he doesn't want us to fetishize commodities. He doesn't want us to get all weirded out as if there's something fetish-like about a commodity. All a commodity means is that a society has chosen a particular way to get goods from producers to consumers by means of endless haggling. Now a step back, I can see from some of your faces, to give this a context. Precisely because markets were not, prior to capitalism, a major way that goods and services were distributed, the arrival of capitalism, which as you're going to see later from Marx, has nothing to do with market exchange. Nothing. But the coincidence that the arrival of capitalism is also the commodification of so many goods and services has led Marx and Marxists, and many since, to collapse these two things that are separate as if they weren't. That is, to see in Marxism a critique of the market. Now here's a problem. As you're going to see in the rest of today, Marx wasn't interested in markets. He only talks about them, as I told you, because that's what everyone expects a book in economics to begin with. By the way, if you pick up a textbook today in economics conventional, it begins with markets. Demand and supply, that's about markets. That's what it is. So what Marx confronted, we still have. But my point here is that you get clear that for Marx, the market is something different. So Marx, if you ask me the question bluntly, did Marx like markets? The answer is he did not. He thought they suck. That wasn't the particular word he used, but that was the idea. Markets are no good. And by the way, he didn't hate markets because of how they got the goods and services distributed, although he made criticisms of that too. He was more almost aesthetic in his horror of markets, a little bit like that father at Thanksgiving. To set up a market means that you set up everybody in the following endless quest, which you should all recognize because you all do this. You enter into countless exchanges in your life, countless moments with another person where you are engaged in a market exchange with that person. And that market exchange has the following rule which governs your behavior. I want to give as little as possible to this shithead and get as much as I can from him. What kind of human relationships are going to be built up among people if the way that they distribute the goods and services they all need amongst each other is premised on this peculiar enmity approach? Compare that to a system in which the elders of the community, based on a notion of what's appropriate, what's needed by different people, distributes goods and services around by some concept of need, of appropriateness, of custom, of fairness. There would be problems with that system too, of course, but you can see why a Marxist, almost on an aesthetic grounds, finds this peculiar institution odious. But actually, if you want criticisms of market, don't read Marx. You don't need Marx. The critique of markets is hundreds of years older than Marx. Markets come into middle to late feudalism all over Europe. Some of the greatest writers, for example, if you want an analysis of the horror of markets, read the French novelist Balzac, who was admired by Marx precisely because his novels made such staggeringly appropriate criticisms. There's a whole tradition in European literature of denunciation at the height of feudalism, of the crumbling of the old feudal order as it is being invaded by the grubby merchant, instead of being driven by the noble ideals of chivalry in feudal and medieval Europe, of noble behavior according to the dictates of God. Instead, everybody's haggling. For those of you that are interested, those parts of European feudalism that were never allowed to become lords and serfs because they weren't Christian, ended up being the merchants, Armenians, Greeks, Jews. So the horror of this new trading system got attached to the individuals who were the early traders. That's the origin of European anti-Semitism, with its long, horrible history. The Jews were the bringers, and they weren't the only ones, but they were the bringers of the trading mentality, which was seen to undo the old feudal society governed by the dictates of religion and morality and ethics. Nothing was more horrible, to say Thomas Aquinas or dozens of others,